scary actually.
Yeah. So I just complained to CSC through the app. Now that through the app, no one has become the phone call, but through the app we can come start. Okay, I think the video is starting. So we'll start with a video of CMA, and then I think I'll just give a small prelude, and then we'll come over. So you are going to share the presentation, right? You're ready.
1958.
Yeah.
Marked the beginning of an idea to bring about how one views and understands management and its potential for meaningful interaction. This led to the birth of Calcutta Management Association or CMA, with Sir Jahangir Gandhi, the then Director General of Tata Iron and Steel Company Limited, as the founder president. CMA today is a vibrant organization, as vibrant as the city it is located in. Affiliated to All India Management Association or IMA, the apex management body in the country, CMA today has a membership base of over 1,000, including nearly 100 corporates. True to its mission and vision to create a platform for the management community where contemporary management ideas can be conceptualized, formulated, developed and practiced, CMA over the years has organized a series of path-breaking meets, workshops, seminars, talks, interactive sessions and exchange programs. We at CMA have taken on the onus of covering a wide area from management education to management practice, with the objective of fostering and developing excellence in management, all to help profit the mind.
Dr. Mukhopadhyay, you can take over, please.
Okay. So good evening. On behalf of Calcutta Management Association and Heritage Business School, I welcome you all. CMA is one of the oldest management associations in the country, starting in 1957. In CMA, we have been engaged in doing various management-related activities throughout the year. Last couple of months, we have been busy arranging a large number of webinars. The endeavor is to provide a platform where eminent leaders share their vision and experiences on contemporary topics. These webinars by eminent people have enriched us immensely. This is being done in collaboration with the Heritage Business School. Heritage Group has been started by Kalyani Bharati Trust, led by a group of eminent industrialists. Heritage Business School, HBS, started in 2003. It provides cutting-edge management education and transforms students into value-based leaders. Due to the exemplary leadership and vision provided by the top management, HBS this year was recognized as one of the best education brands by Economic Times, and ASSOCHAM recognized HBS as the most preferred B school in Eastern region for the year 2020. Today, we commence a new series, the Global Webinar Series. The topic for discussion today is Global Energy Outlook, a Paradigm Shift. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Sudeshna Ghosh Banerjee. She is a practice manager in the Global Energy and Extractive practice at the World Bank based in Washington, DC. She has now been in Washington for many years. She has worked on energy and infrastructure assignments in South Asia and Africa, focusing on project economics, monitoring and evaluation, and a broad range of sector-based issues, including energy access, energy subsidies, and renewable energy. She holds a PhD in public policy from the University of North Carolina and MA in economics from Delhi University. We have the pleasure and privilege to welcome Dr. Sudeshna. Thank you, Dr. Sudeshna, for taking out your valuable time. The structure we have planned is that she has a presentation which she'll run for about, say, 25 minutes, and then we shall have a question and answer session. So please send your questions to the chat box and we shall take it up for Dr. Sudeshna. As a prelude to a session, I may say that energy sector impacts the world economy and GDP very significantly and is of great significance to India. India imports nearly 45% of its total primary energy needs and nearly 80% of its total oil needs. India plans to reduce its dependence by 2022 by increased use of renewable energy, ethanol, etc., to less than 70%. India found its first oil deposits in 1889 at Big Boy, and the natural gas reserves are located in 1960s. India, being a large economy, is the world's third largest consumer and also the third largest oil importer, leading to a huge foreign exchange outgo every year. As we know, Saudi Arabia and Russia were the two largest oil producers, but a paradigm shift happened with USA now becoming the largest oil producer, more than doubling its production from 2009, thanks primarily to shale gas. We remember the oil prices had touched more than $145 per barrel in 2008. Oil prices have remained volatile and since have come down. COVID-19 led to a demand shock, but oil producers were unable to agree on reducing the oil production. On 8 March 2020, the price war started and the oil price crashed to $30 a barrel. It also touched negative in crude futures contract. Negative in crude futures means the people who are actually buying were being paid money to carry the oil because there's no storage space. With this prelude, we now invite our keynote speaker, Dr. Sudeshna, to make her presentation. I personally look forward to this session, and I'm sure it shall be a great session. It shall be a great learning session for all of us. So over to you, Dr. Sudeshna.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mukhopadhyay. Thank you very much for this invitation. I understand that there is quite a bit of inclement weather in Kolkata and Eastern region today. So hope all of you are staying safe and keeping well. Please give me a minute, I'll share my content.
But Dr. Sudeshna, having said about the inclement weather, we still are touching about 100 participants, you know. So I think there's a lot of enthusiasm to listen to you. Yeah, the screen is visible now. Great, great, great.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes, and you can see the screen also. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Yes.
So the topic of my talk is impact of the COVID-19 on the global energy sector. We are in the midst of a global health and economic crisis. The world has never witnessed anything like this before. We are in a great lockdown after the Great Depression. This is the situation that we face today. About 80% of the world is currently living under some sort of restriction. The effect will be felt for many years to come. I will specifically focus on the energy sector. So this is the outline of my talk. I'll present some brief remarks on the context, then the impact of the COVID-19 on the energy sector, then the challenges across different regions of the world. As you may know, the World Bank works in all the regions in the world. There are 6 regions that we are operationally divided in. And I specifically focus on the Africa region. For the last 6 years of my career, I've focused on the Africa region, and I can talk a lot more about the challenges faced by regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, because they are quite similar in the challenges that they face. And the policy response, both the short-term and medium-term and long-term policy responses towards economic recovery, and how the scenarios are being forecasted by the International Energy Agency, and then I will conclude with some final remarks. So COVID-19 has been referred to as the biggest challenge we have faced in decades. and is much more global in nature and impact than most global conflicts. About 300,000 deaths have been recorded, of which 100,000 are in the US and 100,000 in Europe. Lockdowns across the world have caused a sharp decline in GDP growth globally, worse than 2009 financial crisis and increasingly similar to the Great Depression of the 1930s. However, a V-shaped economic recovery expected once the spread of the pandemic is contained. When the recovery begins and how long it will take for the country to reach pre-crisis levels will depend on the reach of the pandemic, the recurrence of future waves as economies open up, the extent of structural damage to the economies, and the availability of a suitable vaccine, and many other factors. Of course, our news media is completely overwhelmed with COVID-related discussions. You can't turn the TV on without these issues being discussed at great lengths. So, focusing on the energy sector, the crisis has had far-reaching impacts on the energy sector. By the end April, nearly all of the population was under some form of containment measure, and more than half of the global energy demand was impacted by partial or full lockdown. The restriction to movement through lockdowns and the global economic slowdown has drastically reduced energy demand, sharper drop compared to the global financial crisis and the oil shocks of the 1970s. What is very interesting now is how energy use patterns are changing. Most valuable consumers from the sales point of view are the industrial commercial consumers who have experienced a significant drop in activity and hence energy demand. On the other hand, the household use has skyrocketed and quite steady the entire day. Typically, what happens is household energy use is relatively low during the day and higher in the evening hours, also called the peak hours, when the household activities pick up. We are getting a lot of data on this load curve, especially in Africa and South Asia, to understand how the situation is emerging. So even before the COVID-19 crisis expanded globally, a price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia was causing a decline in oil prices. With the lockdown across the world, oil demand slashed and the prices fell drastically to some of the lowest levels seen in recent decades. The oil futures went below zero, a completely unimaginable situation. In the graphs, you can see how much the road transport and air transport has squeezed in the recent months, squeezing the demand for liquid fuel products. Focusing specifically on the electricity sector, the economic slowdown globally has decreased electricity demand, particularly for industrial and commercial consumers, as I mentioned below, mentioned in the previous slide, while residential demand has increased slightly. The impact of the crisis on the electricity sector are driven through channels across the value chain. If you really think about the electricity sector, it starts from the generation where electricity is actually produced, moves through the transmission sector, which is the transmission lines and substations, and then goes into the distribution sector, which is the consumer facing sector, a part of the sector value chain. So if you really think about it from the generation point of view, you may see that the private power plant developers and contractors invoking force majeure, solar power plants may get delayed due to supply disruptions from China. In the transmission sector, it faces balancing difficulties as demand drastically shifts from industrial commercial consumers and eventually as economies open up again. In the distribution sector, the load profile is similar to the weekend on all days due to the lockdown. Then the non-payment from residential consumers due to economic impact, as you know, many people have lost their incomes and jobs. And the non-payment to the utilities is actually becoming a very serious issue. A number of utilities are also considering a number of deferment measures so that the consumers do not have to pay over a certain period of time. And there's also difficulties in collection due to social distancing measures. In many countries around the world, people do not pay by their phone. They have to actually go to the electricity office or some other office to pay their bills. And it's not possible with the social distancing measures in place. So the impacts are multidimensional. There are demand shocks, which will cause liquidity crunches for the utilities and might eventually affect service delivery. There are supply shocks and disruption in supply chains that may affect rural and isolated communities, additional costs for utilities to ensure worker safety while maintaining service. But on the positive side, observed increasing share of renewables like solar and wind, geothermal, hydro in the supply owing to must-run status, especially with solar and wind, it's a must-run status fuels and no dependence on the existing plants for on fuel supply chains. Focusing specifically on energy access, as you know, the 840 million people live without access to electricity, almost entirely in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. This challenge still remains very serious, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. South Asia has done actually a very good job in the last couple of decades to move a number of people outside in the living in the rural areas to move into electricity access, and they do consume electricity on a daily basis to meet their needs. But that's not true in Sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, if you look at the top 20 countries with the largest electricity deficit and the top 20 countries with the lowest electrification rate, it's almost entirely composed of Sub-Saharan African countries and a couple of South Asian countries, including India. And there are multiple threats to energy access agenda across the energy poor regions. For the national utilities, there is reduced demand, increased unpaid bills, generation shortages, default in payments from private producers. Disruption in supply chain in off-grid companies. These are typically the small and medium enterprises. I think in India, they're called MSMEs. The investors pulling out of deals with off-grid companies, number of impact investors, they do not want to invest in these companies anymore. So a lot of deals that we are noticing today, which were almost cooked and ready to proceed forward, they have been stopped. A decline in demand due to adverse economic impact on low-income households. Worsening utility finances will delay electrification investments. So a number of utilities who had planned to use their own resources for electrification, they are not going to proceed any further because the finances are very severely impacted. Then lockdown will also affect the movement of sales agent and after sales services. So there is a threat of declining reliability of electricity and cascading impact on economic slowdown. So utilities across the emerging economies struggle with providing reliable electricity supply even during normal times. The crisis will affect reliability of electricity supply due to unexpected variations in load profiles, financial challenges, and difficulties in restoring supply due to movement restrictions and social distancing requirement. Poor reliability of electricity services will feed back into economic slowdown as many industries require continuous power supply. So if you really think about it, for example, the mining industry, most of these industries require absolutely 24/7 electricity supply. Even the tea industry, it requires very reliable electricity supply. If the grid cannot provide this kind of electricity supply, they end up having captive generators, which depend on also on heavy fuel oil, which are high carbon resources to meet the energy needs. Now, here is a diagram with the graph that you see, which is the number of households with an unreliable grid connection in millions. India is definitely among the highest, where the households face very unreliable grid connection in many states in India. So there are regional variations in the impact of the energy sector. The impact of the energy sector across the globe varies depending on specific challenges that are prevalent across different countries and regions. Among some of the challenges of impact and how they vary across the region, we look at low oil prices. So, for example, there are some who are net oil exporters who will face a narrowing revenue base. For example, the Gulf region, the North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, like Angola, Ghana, Nigeria, who are very important oil exporters, Latin America, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and several countries in the former Soviet Union. Net oil importing countries like India may benefit, but expected savings may occur later due to commonly used benchmark plus agreements that they have with other oil exporters. There's decline in energy demand. As I mentioned earlier, the countries with indebted and cash-strapped utilities may struggle with maintaining service. And it's difficult sometimes to even keep the lights on. Default in IPP payments, as you know, the IPPs have to be paid every month. And it becomes extremely difficult for the utilities to pay this payment if they are not getting the revenues from their consumers. A number of contractors are putting in their force majeure notices, and that is also affecting how much electricity is being generated as well for consumer to meet the consumer demand. There's disruption in the off-grid electricity supply chains and financing, as I mentioned earlier, and in countries, for example, in South Asia, West Africa, where there is off-grid plays a very important role. They're already suffering from very serious supply chain issues. And these are also the areas where the energy poverty is very severe. So as you will note from the graph below, the global energy-related CO2 emissions have risen in the past 30 years and quite steeply, right? But as a result of COVID, there is, of course, I mean, you would never think that there's positive impact of COVID anywhere, but there is a positive impact of COVID on the climate. It's actually an outcome beneficial to the environment. So CO2 emissions have declined sharply across the world. Mainly because there's hardly any transport, the energy demand has reduced. While this is a temporary dip, it is likely that some of the behavioral and social changes might stay in different forms. Reduce work travel, more work from home, potentially leading to a medium-term decline in CO2 emissions. So we do think that the COVID will have a positive impact on CO2 emissions and climate change considerations over a medium to longer term. So now that I've elaborated on the diagnostic of the impacts, where do we go from here? So there are some suggested policy response in the short term. The policy response to the crisis can be divided into immediate measures to manage the crisis. The crisis right now is much more of a medical crisis, but longer term structural measures are some of which make use of opportunity provided by the crisis to implement much required structural changes in the energy sector. As we tell all our clients, you should never let a crisis go to waste. How can we use the crisis to bring about much more serious reforms in various sectors of the economy? India has been doing a very good job and issued a number of structural reform measures, which probably could not have been possible in the normal times. So the objective of the short-term measure is to ensure energy service delivery, especially to health centers and other critical government services, while maintaining health and safety of associated staff and financial sustainability of the energy service providers. So the key elements of a short-term response are the fast-tracking connectivity of public institutions like healthcare facilities in deep rural areas. It's very interesting that when we discuss about availability of ventilators in many countries in the world, ventilators do not work without electricity. So even if you have ventilators coming in from various countries around the world to a number of developing countries, if you do not have electricity in these health centers, they would not be able to operate. So maintaining critical infrastructure, we are talking to many governments around the world to make sure that they look at electricity as an essential critical service. So they have remained open. So the staff is coming to the office even during the lockdown to make sure the lights are on in the client countries around the world. Shifting to electronic payments to minimize contacts and ensure high collection rates. In fact, India has done a really great job in terms of digital payments for utility bills. That is not true for many countries in Africa. They still go to the utility offices to pay their bills. But what is happening as a result of this crisis is that the utilities and the government are coming up with electronic payment options, pay through their cell phones, etc., so that there is hardly any contact among individuals to pay these bills. And providing emergency fiscal support to utilities. In fact, this is a big part of our work right now, that how can we provide budget support to governments around the world so that they can keep the lights on especially in electricity and water, which is absolutely essential for for not only meeting this pandemic immediately, but also the economic recovery over a longer term. So over the medium to long term, the governments can take policy actions to drive structural changes. As I mentioned earlier, you should never let a crisis go to waste. So a few points here. The decline in oil prices offers an important opportunity to reduce the fossil fuel subsidies without impacting end user price, especially when governments around the world need additional fiscal space to provide economic stimulus and take measures to mitigate the COVID-19 crisis. The pathway to economic recovery offers opportunity to invest in clean energy transition, such as solar and wind, through infrastructure investments by the government and private sector. Most of these investments are as PPPs or IPPs. Different forms of private sector participation have been piloted in various countries around the world. Other investments in the energy sector, such as expanding energy access, improving energy efficiency, accelerating electrification of heating, transport, and industries, also have a dual impact of providing economic stimulus as well as mitigating GHG emissions. Also, there are possibilities for job creation in renewable energy industry. These are called green jobs, as well as local electrification works that are going to be important in the economic recovery phase. So policy responses are needed to maintain the momentum on the clean energy transition. So there's a recent paper which provides guidance on the appropriate policy measures that align with crisis response in the short term and ensure sustenance of the clean energy transition in the medium and long term. In the short term, there are immediate crisis response, as I mentioned earlier. It's a health response where it's important to ensure that existing green policies are not overturned, temporal waivers instead of structural changes, resisting temptation to push green agenda in short-term relief packages that may affect crisis response, and contingency planning to account for medium-term horizon of the new normal. At this point, we don't know how the post-COVID world will look like, right? And we always think of going back to normal, but we don't know what that normal will be. We call it the new normal. And in the medium term, there's focus on economic recovery, low interest rate to help with green investments, proactive support to alternate fuel technologies in an environment of low oil prices, preparing energy transition frameworks as roadmap for green stimulus packages. Over the longer term, we hope that the energy transition will be more shock-proof. That is, it can survive a number of these natural disasters as well as pandemic kind of situations. Adaptive policies that mitigate risks of low effectiveness or dismantling in case of crisis. This is something which we are seeing in a number of countries around the world, that once this kind of pandemic hits, then a number of renewable energy developers are very worried that the governments will stop their license or the PPA will be cancelled. Then what do they do with the assets that they have that they already have in these countries? Use of hybrid instruments such as cap and trade with price collar, the policy designs with automatic relief for those most affected. Now, what will happen to the oil demand? And of course, this is the $1 million question, and there are many research going on around the world that how the oil prices will bounce back, etc. Billions of dollars are actually lost from the revenue base of many oil exporters. But how does the International Energy Agency really look at the future in terms of the oil demand recovering? So while oil demand will recover as lockdowns are lifted, it's not expected to reach the pre-crisis levels by the end of the year. The extent and speed of recovery depends on the crisis mitigation, the speed and extent of lifting lockdowns, the future wave of infection, the extent of the impact of economic slowdown in people's consumption patterns, how soon the airlines start, because there's a huge dependence on oil, and of course the public transportation. So there are many factors that are going to be important, and how the next few months play out is going to affect how the oil demand is again picks up. Now, how does a recovery scenario look like for electricity? So overall electricity demand in 2020 is expected to be lower by 5% compared to the demand in 2019. This decline is unprecedented since the Great Depression. As I had mentioned earlier, when electricity was also confined to advanced economies and upper income sections of the world. As you can imagine, in 1930s, electricity access was extremely low in pretty much all countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So we are really talking about the developed countries in 1930s. The current decline is 8 times decline during the global financial crisis, which was just in 2007, 2008. So only 10 years back, but even then the current decline is about 8 times worse. Importantly, while the demand in China and India did not decline as rapidly during the global financial crisis, both countries are already seeing slackening demand prior to COVID-19. So even in a faster recovery scenario, electricity demand will still be lower by 2%. Slower recovery scenarios and wider spread across Africa and Latin America might cause declines larger than 5%. So that was on electricity demand. How do we see the electricity supply? So the must-run nature of the majority of the lower carbon resources such as solar and wind and the typically low variable costs have led to an increase to their contribution to the electricity supply. In fact, the last 5-6 years have been really, really good for these kinds of low carbon resources such as solar and wind. The prices that we are seeing in solar auctions, many of them supported by the World Bank and other regional development banks. And of course run by the country governments, and we see the prices are absolutely very impressive. We are looking at about 3 cents, 2 cents a kilowatt hour in number of countries. And if you really compare that with often the heavy fuel oil based energy systems, which can be anywhere near 25 cents a kilowatt hour, 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Recently, I was in Somalia, which is a country that I cover, and there the electricity cost is about $1 per kilowatt hour. This is the most expensive electricity system in the world. So it's actually quite scary to see countries, such fragile countries, where the electricity is so expensive. And these are the countries who are also trying to develop the economy. It's extremely difficult to do so with the electricity cost that high. And we do expect the increase of this renewable energy in this energy systems to continue. And it's likely that such resources will surpass coal in electricity generation. In the longer term, continued investments in low carbon sources will be necessary to maintain this momentum. So finally, the last slide, just to sort of summarize the points that I've already made in the previous slides. This is an unprecedented crisis. In fact, the kind that we have never seen before, and I don't know whether we'll ever see this kind of crisis in our lifetime again. Impact is dependent on exposure to different shock elements. As I had mentioned earlier, there's a lot of parameters. The sharp decline in energy demand, oil prices, economic slowdown, disruption in the global supply chain affect different countries according to their exposure to these elements. And the policy responses that the governments will design will be very dependent on the weightage of these various factors. It's important that balancing the emergency response, the situation that we are in right now is a health crisis. So how these crises can be met in the near term is very different from the medium to longer term measures that is going to be much more of an economic recovery measures. And so the crisis requires that the emergency response ensures that there's reliable energy services to maintain the health of energy utilities, while of course providing an opportunity to introduce longer term structural changes, including improving the emergency preparedness of the energy sector. What we see is that in a number of countries around the world, and none of the utilities had actually prepared for this kind of an emergency because it was completely unanticipated. We see that number of the transmission lines, etc., they have been more resilient to say, cyclones and typhoons. I think there's a lot more resilience in the infrastructure assets, but this kind of pandemic was absolutely unexpected. We do expect that the recovery will be dependent on the length and extent of the crisis. While a U-shaped recovery is expected, it will go down and then it goes up. The gradual return to the pre-crisis level of energy demand may not happen by the end of this year. At this point, we don't even know whether it will happen by the end of this year or it will take much longer time to recover. The energy mix may also fundamentally change during the recovery. We expect that it will become more green. So there's a point that we are highlighting in many of our discussions is build back better and greener. So the green part of it has to be important element of the recovery, and ensuring momentum in the clean energy transition, so that the governments who have already started on this endeavor to bring more green energy in their energy mix should continue on that path. Let me stop here, and I'm available for any questions. Thank you.
So Dr. Sudeshna, thank you so much. I know you have so much pressing work. You have to cover a big area, but in spite of that, you made a structured presentation. So I really want to thank you for that, and to take out time today, early morning in the United States. It's like 9 o'clock in the morning, is it? Or 8 o'clock in the morning right now, right?
It's 8:10. Yeah, it's 8:10.
It's 8:10. So thank you so much for being so up and early for us. So we have a lot of questions coming because a very interesting topic. The first question I want to read out is from our Mr. Shenoy, who is the Vice President of the Calcutta Management Association. He is talking of the rationalization of the power tariffs. He is saying that now there is surplus power choosing lower demand. So how do you see the power tariffs? Structurally, are you seeing any change structurally?
This is true. In a number of countries, we do see that there is a temporary surplus, but we are not advising our countries to change the power tariffs to meet this sort of this temporary blip. That is actually quite serious, because if you change the tariffs and then will you go back again, once the situation gets better? You can't do that. But at the same time, what we are supporting a number of utilities on is that if they want to defer utility bill payments, etc., to help the affordability of the consumers specifically, and there will be fiscal impact on the utilities in terms of paying for this generation capacity. As you mentioned earlier, that there's going to be surplus, and most of these contracts that they have with the utilities have with the IPPs, they are take or pay contracts. So irrespective of how much you are consuming, you are actually taking that energy and you have to pay for it. So as a result of that, there is going to be fiscal burden on both the utilities as well as on the governments. But at the same time, the governments have the responsibility of ensuring the electricity tariffs remain affordable to the consumer. So it's a very, very important balancing act, ensuring the fiscal sustainability of the utilities as well as ensuring affordability of their wide consumer base.
Understand that. One question is from our faculty, Dr. Bobby Basu. She teaches operations and supply chain management. So her question as a faculty is, her concern is that, because of storage problems, how the oil companies can now control or plan the level of production with the demands being so low. And the storage is a problem for oil.
Yeah. To say you're absolutely correct. In fact, there's a lot of discussion now that the storage capacity is actually almost full. Yeah. And there is not more that you can add to the storage. So actually the resources will be lost if they can't be stored. And once they're stored, then of course they go into their specific supply chains. But at this point, the demand is so low, they do not even have contracts for them to be released. So it's a very serious situation in the oil storage industry for sure.
Parthasarthi Bhawal, he is in the corporate relations in Heritage, the executive. He is saying that, even though the crude oil, the prices are coming down, we're seeing from say $145 per barrel to 80, then 65, and now 30. But the government of India has been increasing and the states have been increasing the taxes. So the retail level, there is no passing on. The retailers are not having any advantage. So do you think it's a prudent policy for the government of any state government or any central government to actually keep on taxing so that the retail prices in a developing country like India? Or do you think we should actually bring down the prices so that, the consumers get a stimulus for the spending?
So this is a very important topic, and a lot of research has gone in what is the best way to manage fluctuations in oil prices. And even without COVID, the prices of the oil was actually coming down even in the pre-COVID phase.
Mhm.
And right now the Brent crude is about $20 a barrel, and the oil futures was below zero recently. So it's a very sort of unprecedented kind of situation. Now, the question you are asking is that how do you sort of smoothen the price changes, and how does it affect the consumers? From our experience, there are various sort of examples around the world. Some countries use stabilization funds, where they have the when the oil prices actually go down, then they have then the prices reduce, and then when the oil prices go up, then they have some resources coming in from the stabilization fund. We see that this kind of fund, which has been used in Indonesia and other countries, it doesn't work very well. From our point of view, the fuel taxes is actually a better way of managing and smoothing the oil prices for the consumers than any others. But this is very much a discussion which is ongoing. I don't think anybody can tell you for sure that this is the best way to do this. But our view is that stabilization funds are not the best example, but the fuel taxes are probably better in terms of managing the prices.
Mhm. Our student of second year, Sumaya, MBA student of second year, she's saying that, China practices all the manufacturing, is the manufacturing of the world. Everything go to US, you find made in China. But, like we're talking of replacing China. Do you think, Dr. Sudeshna, it's possible to replace China commercially? Though we may be done emotionally, but do you think it's possible to really replace China?
This is a very interesting question, and at some level, China has emerged as the manufacturing capital of the
Yeah,
world.
yeah, yeah.
Everything is produced in China, and it was interesting. We saw a few years ago that the U.S. flags that you use on July 4th, which is Independence Day, even U.S. flags are produced in China. So it's a very interesting situation where so much of the world's manufacturing has actually moved to China. But now what we see under the COVID is, of course, there's a lot of political sort of dynamics. There is geopolitical tensions. The countries are actually becoming much more inward looking, and trying to see that if they can produce most of the essentials at home. What we also see in some countries in Africa, which are landlocked, which do not have, which where the supply chain takes a longer time to get to those countries. And many of these goods come from China. It has been affected. The supply chain has been affected, and they are trying to figure out whether many of the essentials can be produced in house within the countries. This is a very big blow to globalization, and I hope that the over a period of time, as the COVID crisis is gets to a better place, that there will be more thinking about what is the best way to ensure that essentials reach most of the countries. At the same time, the manufacturing capabilities are also improved in some of the countries if they wish to do so. But important to see how the geopolitics play out. That from my point of view, it will be the U.S. China, how the relationship
Very important. Yeah.
is presented. As you can imagine, the President Trump, every day there is something or the other in the news in terms of how he's looking at China. So yeah, so those are going to be important. But more than the economic part, I think the political part is going to be quite important, looking ahead, and how China is viewed by most of the countries.
Our student Anirban Majumdar, he's a first year MBA student. He says that, like India is going through a very bad phase. We have tried to do some measures, but mostly on the supply side. So what can be done to stabilize Indian economy and to kickstart the economy once again?
Are there any other questions, Dr. Mukhopadhyay? Let
Yeah.
me think about it a little bit, because
Okay.
this is
Okay.
a very,
No,
very
this is a macro level question. Yeah.
macro level question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Indian government has been doing a very good job in coming up with stimulus packages. But the interesting is that how do you sort of create create demand. I mean, how do you
Yes,
sort of
yes, creating
jumpstart
demand.
demand in the
Yeah,
in
yeah,
the
yeah,
economy,
yeah.
especially in a situation where so many people have been affected very badly in the crisis.
Mhm.
In the US, there's a lot of stimulus checks. People have been given cash so that they can go and spend, and that is what creates a demand in the economy. In a number of countries, there are social protection measures, to give them cash compensations, etc. But the most important thing is to create generating the demand and also providing sort of jobs. And in that situation, infrastructure is going to be very, very important to ensuring jobs as well as creating this demand for the economy to grow and recover.
Just a quick update on the weather from Calcutta, since you have a linkage at Calcutta. It is very inclement. The winds are blowing at even at my house, which is nowhere near the sea. So, but I want to thank Lord Krishna that we could have your presentation and we could have your question answer. So I'm really thankful. One quick question: they're saying that why is solar energy not taking off in India? What's the reason for that? It's not taken off as much as should have, no? Because it's so oil
Actually, that's
dependent.
not true.
Okay.
Solar energy is actually doing incredibly well in India.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
In fact, India is emerging as almost like the big hub of solar. And so there are two sort of sides to it. One is the on-grid solar, which is where some of the large sort of solar parks have come in, and India has adopted a very interesting auction mechanism to develop these parks. But the reason why you say this is that if you look at the overall energy system, India's energy system has expanded rapidly in the last couple of decades. Now it's, I think, 300 gigawatts. If you
Yes,
really
yes.
think about it, in 1991 it was about 75 gigawatts or so.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
expansion has been quite dramatic, almost 5 times.
Yeah, yeah.
And solar and wind have played quite an important role in the last
And I
I
think
would
it will
say
be
last 5-6 years. Yeah,
a lot of aggressive expansion plans also there. Yeah. The next 2 years
exactly.
we'll have lot more things coming up. Yeah.
But the issue in India is that coal remains the base load, and,
Yes,
and
yes,
that
yes.
that's really how the system is balanced. The question is that how much of the intermittent renewables can the Indian system take, and that improvement has really happened in India. The system is becoming much more robust to take in much more of these intermittent renewables. But I'm very, very hopeful about India. It's emerging as the solar capital of the world. As you may know, Prime Minister Modi and President Macron are the co-chairs of the International Solar Alliance, which many countries have signed up. In
Yeah.
addition to the grid-connected renewables, there is also the off-grid sector. As I was mentioning earlier in my presentation, there are many solar companies, small solar companies, who are providing these solar kits and solar home systems to many households, as well as they're providing standalone solar systems to schools, hospitals, etc. So the solar industry is actually booming in India. It's
I
just that
agree.
you
I
don't
agree.
see it so much
No, no,
because
no, I
in
agree.
terms of overall energy mix, it might be still be small. So
Dr. Sudeshna, another interesting question from Kritika Dwivedi. She is saying that is nuclear power a safe option for India and other countries?
So from the World Bank side, we actually do not work so much in nuclear power, mainly because of the safety issues, and also there's a lot of geopolitical issues associated with nuclear power. So I don't recall that the World Bank has worked on this topic for many years. At least not in the last 15 years that I worked in the World Bank. So the question is that whether the nuclear power is a good option for India or not. Of course, it depends on the least cost power development plans. This is something that we support in most of our client countries, that there has to be a plan about how you're going to develop the energy system. And not only is the cost from the economic point of view, but also later on the governments would also wonder about whether it's feasible to have those kinds of energy resources. If you have a lot of geothermal resources, if you have solar and wind resources, should you really go for nuclear option, even if it's cheaper? So these are the questions that is very important for the governments to have consultations and discussions, considering the safety issues, especially in a country like India, which is so populated. is it really a good option given that they have so much of solar, wind, and hydro
Yeah,
resources?
hydro.
Yeah.
Achha, Dr. Sudeshna, can you tell us on the macro level, we use these words, World Bank, IMF, and IFC. What are the basic role for a country like India? What are the three institutions actually doing for India or can do for India?
Okay, so if I can explain a little bit further, IMF is, of course, the financial stability is their most important mandate, is to make sure that the macroeconomic situation is in balance in number of countries. So they provide a lot of fiscal stimulus packages around the world. As you may remember, during the 1991 crisis in India, IMF came to India's rescue, and that was a package that actually helped supporting the huge economic reforms that India undertook in 1991. What the World Bank is very much a development bank. We work across all the development priorities of the countries, and from social protection to poverty alleviation to rural development to water, sanitation, energy, transport. So just to give a little bit more about how the World Bank is organized, we have 14 global practices across these specific themes that I mentioned. And I work in the energy practice of the World Bank. And we also have two sister institutions, IFC, which is a private sector arm of the World Bank. And IFC works primarily with private companies. They provide equity, debt, and various technical advisory services for the private sector. Often we work on projects together with IFC. We come in from say supporting the government's equity. They come in from the debt side. So it's a very important collaboration to support PPPs specifically in developing countries. We also have MIGA. MIGA provides political risk insurance. As you know, many countries the private sector will not come in without insurance. So they provide this kind of various kinds of covers for the private sector. As I mentioned, in many of the risky environments, like in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, we often go all together, IFC, MIGA, World Bank, and we come in with our instruments to support PPPs in these countries. So specifically on COVID response from the World Bank, we have, I think, just approved credit for $1 billion for health response, and then $1 billion for social safety net. And then there's also a package which is being prepared to support the SME sector, which is the MSMEs, I think that's what it's called in India. So it's a huge package actually of support for India during the COVID crisis.
I think, Dr. Sudeshna, we almost near 1 hour, and thanks to Lord Krishna, we could do it. We are all very concerned. And today, many of them are actually writing to me that their connections are very fragile and the laptop backup is also there. So I think I will, before asking my colleague at CMA to give a formal vote of thanks on my personal behalf, on behalf of Calcutta Management Association, on behalf of the Heritage Business School, we would like to thank you immensely. And we'd also request that when you come to Calcutta, you keep coming. You come for very short duration, so plan out a longer duration so that we can have you, and properly this thing. You can come and actually be our guest at Heritage Business School and address our students and do a program with CMA. So thank you, Dr. Sudeshna. And may I now request Mr. Anil Garg to have his formal concluding remarks. And Dr. Sudeshna, we nearly had 100 participants, notwithstanding our inclement weather. So God has been very kind to us. Inshallah, it was very good. So Mr. Anil Garg, your concluding remarks, please.
So thank you very much, Dr. Sudeshna Banerjee, for a very interesting overview of the energy sector. The energy sector, as we know, is huge. I mean, it's very, very large, and to be able to encapsulate the various implications across three horizons, immediate, medium, and long term, in a short presentation is really very, very commendable, and it came through very clearly in terms of the implications. For example, in the immediate term, you spoke about the need to continue to supply power and electricity to the developing countries and to people who don't have it. in spite of constraints of much lower prices and unremunerative prices. And the other end of the spectrum was the agenda of replacement of fossil fuels with renewables. And like you rightly said, you should never let a crisis go to waste. I think you spoke very eloquently about the fact that we must continue our shift to renewables, even though they may not make financial sense in the immediate term, because one tends to compare the price of fossil fuels versus cost of renewables and say, oh, it's not really viable below, let's say, $40-50 a barrel. But it's a longer journey and a longer objective. And so we got that quite clearly, that renewables is the way to go in the interest of sustainability, as well as in the interest of overall emission control and environment, etc. So, and apart from that, I was very impressed by the array of questions you fielded, ma'am. It was not restricted to the energy sector. It was a whole spectrum. And I really wanted to thank you for that as well. And overall, I'm sure our participants have learned a lot and been enlightened from your talk. And on behalf of CMA, I thank you once again and look forward to meeting you when you're in Calcutta next. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Garg, and thank you, Dr. Mukhopadhyay. And all of you stay safe. Thank you.
Yeah, have a great day. Have a great day at Washington.
Yeah.
And let's hope the weather improves in Calcutta.
Thank you.
Thank you.